All right. A nice way to start the day there with a little test, wasn't it? Horrible. I hope it wasn't too bad. Perhaps we'll take a look at the answers later on. So we've got through the 16th century. We've looked at the Tudor period, the kings and queens, the society, a little bit of the literature and the culture. So let's move on to the 17th century. It's rather neat that more or less at the end of the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth dies and the Tudor period comes to an end. So the 17th century is basically what we call the Stuart period, more or less. Thanks very much. So we get this King James. If you remember, a long, long time ago, Henry VIII's sister married the King of Scotland. And now Henry VIII's family has died out. His 3 children have died without having any babies, without having any children. So the nearest relative to take on the throne of England is the King of Scotland, King James. He's King James VI of Scotland, the 6th king with the name James from Scotland, but the first King James of England. So let's take a look at his story. Firstly, the accession. Accession is the process of becoming king, the ceremony at which James becomes the King of England. Just going back over that family tree, he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had her head chopped off by Elizabeth. If you remember that story, she was the Catholic champion. The Catholics wanted her to be the Queen of England. Elizabeth kept her prisoner for many years. I think I said prisoner didn't really mean she was locked up in a dungeon. She was staying with a rather nice family who treated her very well for most of the time. The only thing is she was not free to leave the area. She had to stay in that area. But in the end, it was found that she'd been writing letters to people who were actually trying to kill Elizabeth. And Elizabeth said, okay, well, that's crossing a line. And she chopped her head off. So that was one of the reasons why Spain then went and declared war on England. Spain not being very happy that a Catholic princess, or queen even, was having her head chopped off. So, going back beyond that to her grandparents, great-grandparents, her great-grandparents, here, the sister Margaret of Henry VIII was her great-grandmother. And, sorry, was James's, I'm getting confused in my own story now, was James's great-grandfather. And basically, you had this kind of thing going on quite a lot in those days. They would say, the English would say, James, we're really sorry about your mum. I mean, you know, we chopped her head off. But will you be our king? And James says, oh, it's an io. Yes, I will. Okay, which might seem a bit strange in a way, but actually he didn't even know his mother. All right, he grew up separately. He didn't really know his mother at all. So from that point of view, perhaps it's not that strange. But these kinds of things did happen in those days. So they chopped off his mother's head, but they made him king. Let's see what developed. Okay, just a little bit of text explaining that. Henry VIII's sister had married James Stuart, and then Elizabeth died, so the great-grandson, James VI, became King of England. England and Wales were already united, and From 1542, Henry had said that he was also the King of Ireland, so English control over Ireland was getting stronger and stronger during this period. And now Scotland is not formally joined, but united through the King with England. It wasn't until the 18th century that Scotland formally united, and Ireland not until the 19th century. But basically, once James became king, these four countries were now pretty closely linked together. We don't start talking about a united kingdom until 1707. The United Kingdom really begins in the 18th century. So we're still talking about England rather than the United Kingdom or even Britain, because Scotland continued to be a separate country, even though the two countries had the same king. But they were very closely connected now. They both shared the same religion, roughly speaking. The Scottish tended to be slightly different type of Protestant, but they're both Protestants. The important thing is they weren't Catholic. The Irish suffered much more because they followed the Catholic religion, which was hated by the Protestants, so they had a much worse time. So let's look at the religious question a little bit before we look at other aspects. His attitude towards religion is one of the central features of his reign, one of the most important things to know about if you're talking about James. He was the King of England, and in his own mind, he was the King of England by the choice of God, by divine right. We talked a little bit about this last week, but it's a very important topic, so I'm emphasizing it. The idea that God had chosen him to be the king, and also that he was the head of the church. Since Protestantism had begun, the Bible had been translated into English, as you know, several times. I talked about Henry VIII's time when the first person, Tyndale, to translate the Bible was punished and put to death by Henry. And then a few years later, a man called Coverdale took the Bible that Tyndale had translated and reprinted it with some changes, with Henry agreeing now. So it was a bit ironic that poor Tyndale was put to death in the 1530s, because by a few years later, Henry allowed the Bible to be translated into English, and there were several translations of the Bible into English at this time. But the famous translation, the translation that we've been using for hundreds of years, the one that most people still use and know when they make a quotation from the Bible, it's the authorized version, the King James authorized version of the Bible. So it's the standard version in English of the Bible. And that was published in 1611, and it is a beautiful example of English at that time. Just like Shakespeare, it is a classic work of literature. It's not just a religious book, it's a work of literature. Catholics were very disappointed by James because they'd been hoping that he was going to give them a bit more freedom, a bit more of a chance to live openly in English society, and he didn't. So there was a plot to kill him, led by the Catholics, or led by a small number of Catholics, in 1605, which we'll, if we've got time today, we'll look at. If not, we'll look at it next week. Same thing goes for Puritans on the other side, on the extreme Protestant side. they were disappointed too. Basically, James kept very much to this middle way. If you were a Catholic, you were not going to be properly accepted in English society. If you were a Puritan, you were not going to be properly accepted. You had to follow the middle way. So his reign was, in a sense, not that different from Elizabeth's, because she too was trying to control what she considered the extremes of Catholicism and Puritanism. She was trying to keep everybody in that kind of middle path. James carried on with that policy. He was also a scholar, some kind of academic, up to a point at least, although some of what he wrote would be surprising to us today, as we shall see. He published a number of books on a variety of topics. You'll notice one of them there is a counterblast to tobacco, which had been recently introduced from America. He was very much against tobacco. So we've got that one, which is a treatise against the use of tobacco, and we've got political tracts on various political matters, and I'm going to pick on one of these books because it's particularly surprising. You think an academic person, a scholar, wrote something like this, and it was demonology, which means the study of devils, or akuma. Basically, it's a book about witchcraft, magic. Like a lot of people in those days, James believed that there really were people who worshipped the devil, people who cast harmful spells on people. They were, as you know, punished, put to death in those days. We've talked a little bit about that. Well, James believed in all of this and wrote a book about it. Overall, about 4,000 to 6,000 people were put to death as witches in his country, and about 1,000 in England. So Scotland suffered much worse than England during the time of the witch hunts. There was much more belief in witches in Scotland, and much more of a sense that witches were doing harm in society and harming people. So there's a much larger number of witches put to death in Scotland at this time than in England. Which brings us on to Shakespeare. Shakespeare knew that James had written this book about witches, and he wanted to write a play to welcome the new king. And so he wrote Macbeth. Macbeth is based on real history. There is a Macbeth in Scottish history, and as often, Shakespeare used Holinshead's history book, Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland. He used Holinshead to get some of the basic background for his play, but he changed the play, he changed the real story, he changed the historical story a huge amount. And one of the things that he put into the story, which is not in the history, of course, is the witches. The witches in Macbeth were put in the story partly to make the story more exciting, but also to please King James, who believed in witches. There are no witches in the actual history, nor in Hollinghead's account of the history. So Shakespeare just put them in to please the king. So this whole idea of witches was partly based on the Bible. We talked a bit about it last week. Why were women usually the ones accused of being witches? Well, in the Bible, of course, it's Eve who takes the apple. And because Eve takes the apple in the Garden of Eden, in early modern thinking, it meant that women were more open to being evil. Women more easily followed the path of the devil. So, because of the Bible story of Eve, who's tempted by the snake, because it's her who eats the forbidden fruit and gives it to Adam, because of this, women are seen as more likely to be evil. So, it's not the only reason, but it's quite an important reason. And again, it's connected with religion, it's connected with the Bible story. It's also considered that witchcraft was a result of a deep-seated hatred and fear that many men at that time seem to have had. A fear of women. And I don't know if we can say that James hated women, I'm not sure, but witch hunts are generally seen as a form of prejudice against women. So, in James's personal case, like a lot of people who are basically homosexual, he got married, he had children, but he was probably at least bisexual, and he openly favoured men in his court in a way that leads most historians to assume that he was probably homosexual. Here's his wife. There was a kind of joke that went around in those days. It was in Latin, so I don't think we find Latin a very easy language for jokes, but it said, Rex fuit Elizabeth nunc est regina Jacobus. Elizabeth was our king, because she was a very manly, powerful sort of woman. Now James, in Latin, James is Jacobus, and now James is our queen. So there was this kind of Latin epigram going around, basically describing him as a womanish man. Okay, so internationally, in terms of his politics, his international relations, what did James manage to achieve? Firstly, he kept England out of the complicated power struggles that were going on in Europe at the time, which I think we have to say was a good thing. He kept peace with Spain for a large part of his reign, which was... It ended up in disaster, but for quite a few years there was something called the Spanish Match, which was a planned marriage between James's son Charles, who became Charles I after his father, he became the king, and the youngest daughter of the King of Spain, Maria Ana. So, because of this plan for a marriage, Spain and England kept the peace for several years. If you remember, the Spanish Armada had been in 1588, and Spain was fighting against England at that time. James managed to stop that fighting with Spain and create a kind of alliance because there was going to be a marriage, but the marriage was never going to happen. Firstly, the English Parliament didn't want Charles to marry a Catholic. Maria Anna was, of course, Catholic. Spain was a Catholic country. Maria Anna was a Catholic. The government wanted, the Parliament wanted Charles to marry a Protestant. And in the end, Charles said, "No, Takusang, I've had enough hanging around with politicians trying to tell me what to do and waiting and for this and that. I'm going to go directly to Spain. I'm going to win her heart." And so he went off to Spain and, okay, here I am, baby, I'm here to take you in marriage, to sweep you off your feet. Unfortunately, she hated him. As soon as she met him, she didn't like him. The Spanish match was over. The other big thing that was going on in Europe at that time was the 30 Years' War, which was a very dirty, very nasty war. And thank God England was not, for most of the time, involved in it. So James did very well here, keeping England out of a very nasty war, a very bloody war that did no good to anybody in the end. And again, this was through political marriage. He married his daughter off to the Elector Palatine. Germany at this stage was divided up into little principalities, little smaller countries. And Frederick V was a little bit lower than a prince or a king, but later on he became the King of Bohemia. So he was quite an influential person in Europe, and Elizabeth, James's daughter, was his queen. And then a few months later, Frederick got into a fight with the Holy Roman Emperor. The Roman Empire, of course, as such, had come to an end, but there was a sort of shadow empire going on, especially in the east of Europe, for a long time. It's a complicated story, and I won't try to go into it all. So basically, Frederick lost his crown, and James, you'd think James would say, "Wait a minute, this is my daughter's husband. I'll go in there and protect him and support him and fight for him and my daughter." But he said, "No, I'm not going to get involved. It's not my problem." So he kept out of this war that was going on in Europe. In the end, because of Frederick losing his position, his crown, you got this terrible war, and James kept England out of this terrible war. I mean, whether it was a good politics or just because he was a coward, said, I'm not brave enough to go and fight this war. It could lead my country into day. I don't know what the reasons were, and historians would understand it differently. But basically, he did keep England out of a very nasty war. So, looking ahead, eventually the Stuart line was going to die out, just like the Tudor line did. And when that happens later on in the 18th century, it's going to be the descendants of Elizabeth and Frederick who are the closest relatives. And so it's that family that's going to come in and take the throne in the 18th century. And Queen Elizabeth II is descended from that family. So that's the family that we have today. Basically, a German family. Okay, yes, the 30 Years' War, a very nasty, bloody affair. Okay. Next topic to look at, the New World, America, the Caribbean, all that area. The first successful colony that England had was actually called Jamestown, after King James, in Virginia. Most of the settlers died during the first winter. They were attacked by the local people. There was not much food around. A few of them survived, and from then on it went on to become an important colony with an economy based on tobacco. Tobacco became hugely important, and you get 7,000 tobacco houses in London. While I'm on the topic, you might think of other products that were coming from the New World at this time. The potato had been introduced. Imagine a life with no potatoes. Imagine how would, we don't have rice as a basic foodstuff. What did we English do before we had potatoes? We couldn't have fish and chips. We didn't have any chips. Goodness me. So potatoes, tobacco, coffee, tea, sugar, all these kinds of products were coming in from the New World. In the case of Jamestown, it was tobacco. And it was tied up with another form of trade, which was slavery. The slave trade started round about this time. The so-called slave triangle, which really, when we look at the British Empire, in the East it's different. India obviously had its own ancient culture and society, and so did other Asian countries, but America was treated rather differently. The people there were more easily, well, not just controlled, but killed, both by the Spanish and by the British and the Portuguese and others. Having killed off most of or many of the Native Americans, the country was in need of slave labourers, and they were brought over from Africa. The other famous thing about this colony is Pocahontas, that we probably know from Disney or something. It was the founder of this colony who married the daughter of the Native American chief, Pocahontas, who later on went to England and so on. So it sort of seems like quite a romantic story, because the story is that she saved his life when he first came to America. When he first met the tribe, there was a kind of meeting, and they said they were going to kill him, and the daughter rushed in and said, "Don't kill him." She was just a little girl, and then she grew up and married him. Actually, it may be a bit, again, if you want to know the real history, it's probably not quite so romantic as that, but it's still an interesting story. And there's a picture of what it would have looked like, roughly, once it was properly established. It just looks like a little village, doesn't it? It hardly looks like something really big and important, but it was from little colonies like these that the country of America, as we know it today, got started. This is the late 17th century. Eventually, though, they abandoned Jamestown because it was not well placed. It was on a swampy ground, a kind of sour kind of area. The land was damp, and they moved the town to somewhere else. So by that time, there were already other colonies growing up, and the British Empire was kind of slowly getting started. Another important thing that happened connected with the New World was the Pilgrim Fathers, which if you study American history, this is kind of more or less where everything begins for American history. The famous ship, the Mayflower, and the story of the Puritans who were forced to leave Europe and England because their idea of the church was much too free. Like each church should be independent. Each church should decide its own affairs. They didn't want any kind of pyramid structure with control from above. Each church should make its own decisions. The man who developed this thinking in England was called Robert Brown, and the way of thinking is called congregationalism. A congregation means a group of people who go to church. He wanted each group of people to be free to make their own policies, their own decisions, their own plans. Later on, he changed his name. He changed his mind, but the name stayed. And these people who wanted this type of church were called Brownists. And they were not accepted, of course, because it's all about power. These people did not want anybody having power over them. They were forced, many of them, to leave the country in search of somewhere where they could be free to develop their religion in their own way. So off they went in 1620 in the Mayflower. And as I say, for a lot of people, that's considered to be the kind of founding of modern America. So the Pilgrim Fathers, sometimes called the founding. Okay, how about back at home? James and his Parliament. He had a lot of problems with the economy. There was a debt of £350,000, which sounds like nothing now, but that debt increased considerably during the first 5 years of his reign. Basically, he had come from Scotland, which was a pretty poor country. Life was pretty basic and simple. And just coming to England for him was like so much luxury. Whoa, let's have a party. Let's blow some money here. And so he did. And one way or another, the national debt increased considerably. And he had a lot of quarrels with Parliament about money. Partly money, partly religion and the constitution. Constitution like Kempo Tekina. Kind of matters, things connected with the running of the country. But at the bottom of his quarrels was basically money. He wanted to be able to tax the people, and Parliament was saying, no, you can't tax people in that sort of way. It's not fair. Well, James, when he disagreed with the Parliament, he would just close it down. He'd just, everybody go home. I don't want the Seijika. I don't need a Parliament. I can run this country by myself. I've got, God on my side. Go home. I don't want you. I don't need you. So he would simply shut down the Parliament. And for a long part of his reign, there was no active Parliament at all. And then by the end of his reign, the country was in a severe economic crisis. So things were not going too well at home. Okay. I see people are still writing things down, so I'll give you an extra little minute or two. Yeah? We all caught up? All right. And then, towards the end of his reign, there was an outbreak of plague. Plague is peseto. Peseto, the word you use in Japanese comes from the French word, la peste. But in English, it's plague. And about 100,000 lives. When you think that the population at that time was less than 3 million people, 100,000 is quite a lot of people. So it's about maybe 3-4% of the population died at that time. And the disagreements between Parliament and the king just got worse and worse when James's son became king. And the next story that we're going to be dealing with is the problems under Charles and how this leads to civil war. Oliver Cromwell, you've probably heard of him. We'll be looking at that in detail next time. But this is the basic story of James, which ends here. That's about it, really.